Rose Vincent was a lonely young woman desperate to escape her life of poverty.
She wanted something more for her life, and she just had to find it.
She thought she'd found the man who could give her what she longed for in wealthy funeral director Mark Bowling.
Rose was going to be Mrs. Rose Bowling. She wanted that more than anything in the world.
But Rose's dream romance would ultimately end in a bloody nightmare.
Somebody just pointed a gun and fired it as fast as they can. Boom, 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 boom.
Now follow police as they try to make sense of a baffling crime. Was it a robbery gone wrong?
The general consensus in Rocky Mount was that the Bowlings had it all.
An act of revenge from a jealous former lover?
There was an ex-husband lurking in the background.
Or would the investigation ultimately unveil a scandalous tale of secrets and obsession?
They were both filled with a yearning they couldn't deny.
This was Rose's Cinderella story. But like most fairy tales, this one did not have a happy ending.
December 8th, 2006 was a quiet morning in the small town of Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Local resident Linda Gardner had just arrived at the home of her friend and co-worker, Julie Bowling. Linda was worried about Julie. She hadn't shown up for work that morning, which was unlike her, and no one had been able to reach Julie on her phone.
Her first reaction was to knock on the door and call her name. And then she looked over and saw the garage door was wide open. Now the fear started to develop. Something was not right. She didn't know what she was going to find, but she headed towards that garage.
Inside, Linda discovered a gruesome scene. Her friend's body lying in a pool of blood.
My friend, she's in a large door.
When police arrived, injuries to Julie Bowling's body made it clear her death had been no accident.
There was several puncture holes. Those looked just like she was shot at close range. This isn't accidental. This is done on purpose. Somebody wanted her dead.
In such a small town, a crime like this was a rare occurrence.
It was definitely a surprise to see any murder in that neighborhood.
Julie was just very likable. I think everybody in the world loved her. She was just a nice individual.
Who could possibly be responsible for this vicious crime?
Little did investigators know that the answer to that question would expose a sordid conspiracy of lies, lust, and betrayal, along with a pair of dark souls who would stop at nothing to satisfy their obsessions. Born in 1979 and raised in rural North Carolina, Rose Parker grew up in a family that struggled to make ends meet.
Rose was raised in a house of need. There was never enough money to take care of things. Her clothes were ragged hand-me-downs, to the point where she was often embarrassed by them.
As a teenager, Rose mostly kept to herself, fantasizing about one day escaping her life of poverty.
She was starting to think that something more was possible for her life.
But then tragedy struck. Rose's stepmother, who'd helped raise her, unexpectedly passed away. Rose was heartbroken, but her father was hit the hardest by the sudden loss.
He could barely function. Rose had to step in at the age of 19 and take care of a very adult responsibility of planning a funeral.
To make arrangements, Rose turned to a funeral home in the nearby town of Rocky Mount, which is where she met 27-year-old funeral director Mark Bowling.
She was so impressed with him. He was gentle, he was kind. He seemed to understand every little bit of pain she was feeling.
Mark grew up in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and unlike Rose, his family gave him everything he needed.
Mark's parents were morticians, so Mark basically grew up in a funeral home.
Mark may have been well cared for growing up, but he was a social outcast. As a teenager, he spent most of his time helping his parents with their mortuary business, instead of hanging out with kids his own age.
Mark was a kind of dumpy, dorky kid. He was awkward socially. And Mark just was the kind of kid that other people bullied.
After high school, Mark went away to college to become a funeral director. When he graduated, he moved to Rocky Mount and opened his own mortuary, Bowling Funeral Home. By the time he was 27, Mark had built the company into a financial success.
He made sure that he projected the image of professionalism and prosperity.
Mark was up-and-coming fellow, could be very personable.
I think it's fair to call Mark Bowling a flamboyant spender. He always had tailored suits. He had a nice watch. He would go on scuba trips and other nice vacations.
Mark's confidence and lavish lifestyle also attracted plenty of local women. The once awkward teenager was now the most sought-after bachelor in town.
Basically, every woman in Rocky Mount was lining up to date him. He dated a lot of women. He always had a different girlfriend. He was kind of a womanizer.
Then, in October of 1998, a pretty young girl named Rose Parker asked him to help plan her stepmother's funeral. Despite the somber occasion, Mark found himself irresistibly drawn to Rose from the moment they met, and it was clear she felt the same way about him.
Rose is 19. She's grieving, and a rich, seemingly powerful man is showering her with attention. She enjoys it.
As soon as the funeral was over, Mark asked Rose to go out with him.
Rose could not say yes fast enough, so she was grateful to him.
Mark pulls out all the stops, takes her to a fancy restaurant. I mean, for someone like Rose, who didn't grow up with any money, this completely sweeps her off her feet.
Throughout dinner, the sexual tension between Mark and Rose grew, and as soon as Mark paid the bill, he and Rose rushed back to his place.
Above the funeral home, Mark had an apartment, and they headed straight there. The sex was wild and crazy.
The 19-year-old and 27-year-old funeral director began dating, and their romance, which had started off hot, only got hotter.
They went 0 to 60 pretty quickly.
Every time they went anywhere, did anything, they ended up in bed. He was insatiable. He wanted more and more sex all the time.
But for Rose, their relationship had come to mean so much more.
Yeah, she loved the sex, but suddenly she found herself falling in love with Mark. She was fantasizing about their future.
In Rose's mind, Rose was going to be Mrs. Rose Bowling. She wanted that more than anything in the world.
So later that summer, when Mark said he had something important to tell her, Rose believed he was about to pop the question. Instead, he made a shocking confession.
Mark told her he was getting married to someone else.
It turned out that Mark had not been exclusively dating Rose. For the duration of their 6-month relationship, he'd also secretly been seeing another and much older woman, and she could offer Mark something Rose couldn't.
She was from a wealthy family in the area. If you're a young business owner looking to make more of yourself, she could have been a good strategic connection.
Mark had plans to buy up all these other funeral homes and turn Bowling Mortuary into a franchise.
Rose was heartbroken, but eventually she tried to move on herself.
After Mark dumped Rose, yeah, it was really depressing for a while, but then she met another guy and fell for him, Scott Vincent, and they were married, and they had 3 kids. He was a part-time electrician. Rose was working at a supermarket.
But while both Mark and Rose appeared to have moved on, one of them secretly had never gotten over their brief but intense romance. And the heartache and obsession growing inside them would soon give birth to a devastation that would rattle their small town and leave both Rose and Mark's lives in ruin. Coming up, police confront a puzzling crime scene.
There was no fingerprints. There was no physical evidence. It was almost a perfect crime.
But is there more to this crime than just one murder?
They didn't know if Mark was a potential suspect or even possibly a victim.
Rose Vincent and Mark Bowling were a pair of former lovers whose intense romance abruptly ended when Mark left Rose for another woman. Both had since moved on and gotten married to other people.
Rose got over Mark. She had a husband and her own children.
But 6 years later, a tragedy would upend one of their lives and leave people wondering if Rose Vincent had really gotten over and moved on from their sudden breakup. On the morning of December 8, 2006, police responded to a report of a woman shot to death in the garage of her suburban home.
She'd been shot 3 times, was lying on her back near an SUV in the garage.
It looked like somebody was standing by, waiting on the outside of the garage, waiting for the door to open. That's when the person discharged a weapon to her and ended her life.
Detectives were quickly able to identify the victim as 45-year-old Julie Bowling.
It was Mark Bowling's wife, Julie Bowling, who together were both owners of a set of funeral homes.
Julie was the woman Mark had left Rose to be with, and in the years since they married, Julie had helped grow Mark's single funeral home into a local mortuary empire.
They're doing well. The Bowling Funeral Home franchise is expanding. I think he gets up to 5 or 6 funeral homes at one point.
Julie brought a strong measure of credibility to Mark. She was well-liked, she was a very sweet woman, and she had connections galore. And that elevated Mark's social status.
In fact, Mark and Julie Bowling had become one of Rocky Mount's most wealthy and successful couples, which made her murder all the more shocking to local law enforcement.
If you know the people, it hits you, for lack of a better way to put it, hits you home. It just, it makes you think, what in the world? Why was this?
Detectives' first thought was that the Bowlings' wealth and social status made them an obvious target.
The general consensus in Rocky Mount was that the Bowlings had it all. Together, they had it all, and it was a great life for them.
Was it simply a case that they came in to rob the home, were surprised by Julie, and shot her?
But investigators immediately found a problem with that theory.
First thing that really stood out was that she had a huge, like 5-10 carat diamond ring on her hand. It's like, come on. If I was robbing, even if my adrenaline was pumping, that ring would go with me.
No money was taken, her mail was still there, her purse was still there, house was not broken into.
Check the whole house to see if there's any forced entry, any windows open, anything broke or something tried to be pried. That house was secured, like Fort Knox.
Investigators combed through the garage, looking for clues, but Julie's killer seemed to have left nothing behind.
There was no fingerprints, there was no physical evidence left at the scene, no casings, no nothing. Just, it was almost a perfect crime.
No one in the neighborhood had seen or heard anything suspicious that night.
Why would somebody randomly choose this woman at 7 o'clock in the morning to kill for obviously no reason? Very, very strange crime scene to wander upon.
Physical evidence wasn't the only thing police had a hard time locating. When they tried to notify Julie's husband, Mark, about her death, he was nowhere to be found.
He wasn't at the funeral home. He wasn't returning their calls. No one seemed to know where he was.
With one half of Rocky Mount's most prominent couple lying dead from gunshot wounds, finding Mark quickly became law enforcement's top priority.
My first reaction was, where is the husband? Because, a lot of crimes that I've dealt with and you see across the nation are committed nearby close relatives, family, friends, husbands, wives, etc.
They didn't know if Mark was a potential suspect or even possibly a victim. I mean, he could have been kidnapped or killed.
Julie's family didn't know where Mark was and couldn't imagine he'd have anything to do with her murder.
Julie was probably the best thing going for Mark, if you want to know the truth, because she complimented him.
In fact, Julie's family couldn't think of a single reason why anyone would want to hurt either of them.
No enemies, no work-related problems, no one who had any ill will towards Julie.
However, they told police there was one person in Rocky Mount whose feelings for Julie sometimes made her uncomfortable.
This was a second marriage for Julie, and there was an ex-husband lurking in the background.
An ex-husband who apparently still carried a torch for Julie.
It was alcohol that broke apart our marriage. She had a drinking problem, and he wouldn't stop. And she just couldn't tolerate it any longer. So there definitely was a dark side to her first husband, and that always opens the door to possibilities.
But when investigators tracked down Julie's ex-husband, he insisted that his drinking days were over. And although he admitted that he would always have feelings for Julie, he claimed he'd been staying away out of respect for her marriage to Mark.
They very seldom ever saw each other, and when they did interact, there was no animosity between the two of them.
More importantly, Julie's ex-husband also had an alibi.
He did clock in at work before the murder could have happened, and was there through the time period where they estimated that the murder did happen.
That leads us back to the who and the why, and they're still investigating the crime scene itself without any real suspects.
Worse yet, police still hadn't been able to track down Julie's missing husband, Mark Bowling.
Where was Mark? Was he alive? Was he even okay?
What investigators didn't then know was that finding what happened to Mark Bowling would not only give them the answers they were looking for, it would unlock a sordid tale of deceit, betrayal, and a stunning conspiracy fueled by an undying obsession. Coming up, police take a closer look at Mark and Julie Bowling's marriage and uncover some disturbing secrets.
He couldn't help himself. He needed sex.
The romance between Mark Bowling and Rose Vincent had been an intense but brief affair. Rose had been a poor 19-year-old searching for a man who could give her a better life, while Mark was a successful funeral home director who'd been allured by Rose's youth and innocence. But both had gone on to marry other people. And now, 8 years later, Mark's wife, Julie Bowling, had been found shot to death inside the garage to their home. Detectives' search for clues had come up empty, and Mark was also missing.
Police were starting to worry that he might also be a victim.
A few hours later, detectives received word that Mark had been located. He was alive and well and on vacation.
The report was that he is on a dive trip in Florida with several other local people from Rocky Mount area.
Police called Mark to inform him of his wife's death.
Mark, it's Lieutenant Joyner of the Sheriff's Office. We've been called out here to your house this morning. Your wife's under the garage and she's deceased.
What? The what? Oh, God! Julie!
Mark sounded genuinely upset, but there was something about his reaction that struck detectives as strange. He didn't ask detectives how Julie had died.
Where's she at?
I'm sorry?
Where's she at?
Mark asked, where was she? To me, if your wife is hurt or killed, what difference does it make where she was?
Also concerning was Mark's apparent lack of urgency about returning home to settle his wife's affairs. Hours after his first call with police, Mark Bowling was still in Florida. Detectives even had to call a second time to ask when he was returning to North Carolina.
Out here in Florida, stupid islands, I'm trying to get a flight home.
If something had happened to my wife, I'd be calling every hour trying to find out, what have you heard now? What have you heard now? Or what have you found out? And that didn't happen.
Suspicious of Mark's odd behavior, police decided to dig further into his and Julie's relationship.
Detectives started talking to anybody who knew Mark or Julie, and pretty soon they heard from friends of Julie's who said that her happy marriage may not be exactly as it seems.
Relations became a little strained between Julie and Mark. And like in a lot of marriages, the strain was due to monetary problems. He was trying to expand too fast. He had expanded to some of the smaller towns around Rocky Mount. And by growing too fast, I think the money was being eaten up.
He was mounting up a horrible burden of debt for as much as $1 million.
But that wasn't all. As investigators dug further into the couple's finances, they uncovered something even more suspicious.
They had a $1 million life insurance policy that Mark had taken out in Julie's name just months before she died.
Detectives couldn't help but wonder, had Mark Bowling somehow arranged his wife's murder to escape a mountain of debt?
Depending on how desperate he was at the time, getting rid of his wife with a large insurance policy was the key to all his problems being solved.
He didn't kill her himself because he was scuba diving in Florida, but maybe he would have hired somebody else to kill her while he was out of town.
Investigators sat down with Mark when he finally returned to North Carolina that evening. When police questioned him about his life insurance, Mark insisted that he loved Julie and would never hurt her. He said the life insurance policy was something they both decided to take out long before their financial problems arose.
He was very positive about the relationship he had with Julie. He had nothing but good things to say about her. He couldn't understand how anyone would do this.
But investigators weren't willing to simply take Mark at his word.
So police say, Mark, you're answering all our questions. You're being very helpful. We just need one more thing to totally clear you of any possible involvement in your wife's death. Would you take a polygraph test?
Mark agreed to take the polygraph. When the test was administered, Mark answered the questions without any signs of deception. All except one.
I said, Mark, we specifically asked you the question of, do you know who took Julie's life? And you failed. Point blank, I said, something you're not telling us.
Faced with the results, Mark put his face in his hands. After a moment, he admitted that he'd been lying to investigators, but not about Julie's murder. Instead, Mark claimed he hadn't told the truth about their marriage.
It starts to become clear that he hasn't been faithful in marriage.
Mark explained that Julie was his best friend and business partner, but when it came to the bedroom, their chemistry was lacking.
Julie and Mark had a normal sex life, but apparently that was not enough for Mark, and unbeknownst to Julie, he was having extracurricular activities.
Mark claimed that his infidelity had only been a way for him to take care of his sexual needs, which is why, he claimed, he'd at first limited his indiscretions to professional escorts.
Mark had gone to a escort service out of Greenville, North Carolina. He was bringing escorts up every week, during the week, and he was using the loft at the funeral home.
He couldn't help himself. He needed sex. He was willing to pay for it, and he was willing to cheat on his wife to obtain it.
And now that his wife was murdered, Mark told police he worried that one of his indiscretions might have come back to haunt him.
He was concerned that one of the women he was sleeping with might have killed Julie.
Detectives, though, were suspicious. Paid escorts didn't seem the type to kill a client's wife out of jealousy. That's when Mark confessed that the affair he was most concerned about wasn't with a prostitute. It had been with a woman he'd had a relationship with before he even met Julie.
He gave the name Rose Vincent at that point.
Mark explained that he and Rose had an intense relationship 8 years earlier, but Mark said he and Rose had reconnected earlier that year when a twist of fate brought the former lovers back together.
Rose was out and her car broke down. When she got out of her car, she looked up and realized she was right behind Bowling Funeral Home.
She had nowhere else to turn, goes in, and there's Mark, the knight in white shining armor kind of situation. He's going to help fix her car.
Mark did more than just fix Rose's car. He confessed that despite getting married, he was still deeply attracted to Rose. Even though she was also married, Rose told him she felt the same way. And it wasn't long before they both gave in to temptation.
They were both filled with a yearning they couldn't deny. It's like magnets drawn together.
Over the next 10 months, Rose and Mark continued the affair, keeping their love a secret from both of their spouses.
Mark and Rose would go into that room up above the funeral home, and that's where they would play and have sex. It was a special thing for both of them.
But by that fall, Mark admitted a feeling of unease over what they were doing began to creep in, especially after Rose confessed to him that for her, their romance was more than just casual.
Rose was out of her mind in love with him.
Rose wanted to be the next Mrs. Bowling, and she was ready for it.
For Mark, it was an unacceptable proposition. Being with Rose meant he'd have to leave his wife, Julie, which would mean giving up everything he'd worked so hard to build.
This was Mark and Julie Bowling's business. They were 50-50 owners.
A scandalous divorce would ruin his business. He would lose everything.
Mark knew it was time to put an end to the affair and told police he tried to break things off with Rose. But she didn't take the news well. Instead, Mark said Rose became obsessed with trying to get him back. He'd even caught her following him and Julie around town on several occasions.
Mark presented an assessment of Rose that probably made the cops think that they were dealing with a jilted lover, an angry woman who was jealous and sworn to revenge.
He describes her as essentially a crazed stalker and says that she has a fatal attraction to him.
Coming up, police pay a visit to Rose Vincent, but would their conversation reveal whether Rose was really a vengeful ex-lover? Or would detectives discover someone else with an even stronger motive to murder Julie Bowling?
He told her we'd get her out of the picture, that it'd be me and you.
From the moment Rose Vincent fell in love with Mark Bowling, she dreamed of getting out of the trailer park and into his sprawling luxury home. But by December of 2006, her dreams had evaporated. Not only had Mark put an end to the affair, but he'd just implicated her in the murder of his wife, Julie.
He said, "She's been stalking me. We used to have a thing, and now she's got an obsession with me."
Eager to hear Rose's side of the story, officers immediately set out to track her down. And while they waited for Rose to be brought in, detectives paid a visit to the Greenville escort service Mark often used to talk to a few of the other girls he'd mentioned.
Sheriff's Department pounced on that information quickly. Not just Rose, but on the other names that he gave as possible people who want to do away with Julie.
The escorts that Mark had hired all had alibis for the morning of Julie's murder. But they also told detectives that the supposedly upstanding businessman hadn't just hired them for individual dates. It turned out that Mark Bowling had a habit for arranging full-fledged orgies.
Not just one woman. Oh no, he'd get 2, 3, or more, all to satisfy his over-the-top sexual cravings. There was no limit for this man.
It seemed that Mark's favorite place to throw his wild sex parties was his funeral home in Rocky Mount.
The downstairs area is a very serene, a lot of people would even say sacred area. Upstairs, Mark has this bachelor pad.
In a little room up there where caskets were kept, hookers, call girls meeting up there at all hours of day and night.
And Mark's dirty secret also came at a steep price. In fact, it sounded to detectives like the Bowling's financial troubles had less to do with him overextending the business and more to do with his expensive sexual adventures.
Costs money to do that sort of thing. Call girls, escort services, whatever you want to call them, are not cheap.
He was paying thousands and thousands of dollars on his nasty little sex habit.
But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. One of the escorts told investigators that during one of Mark's sex parties, he'd taken her to a private room at the funeral home. She said she was used to strange requests from Mark when it came to sex, but that night he proposed something so shocking that she couldn't believe it.
Mark had told her he would pay her 5 figures to kill his wife.
The escort told police that when she turned him down, he played it off as a joke, but now she wasn't so sure. Investigators were stunned. Had Mark actually been shopping for someone to kill Julie?
If it's true, then this guy was lying about everything. Did he just give them Rose's name to throw them off the scent?
I'm sure he thought he was smarter than everybody else. He thought he was smarter than the sheriff's office.
Police wouldn't have to wait long to find out. As detectives left Greenville, they got word that Rose Vincent had been brought in for questioning. When police finally sat down with Rose, she claimed she'd been helping a girlfriend take care of her children on the day Julie's body had been discovered. And she insisted she didn't know anything about Julie's death.
Just like Mark, she's denying everything. She's not playing along.
She was, easy to talk to about anything unrelated to what's going on with the homicide investigation. And then the minute you ask anything about Mark, she drop her head to the floor and not look at you. You ask anything about Julie, of course, same thing, drop her head and not look at you.
From the way Rose was acting, detectives were convinced she knew more than she was telling them. So they tried a ruse to get her to talk.
I tricked her. I said, Rose, I've been trying to get you to tell the truth to help you because we tracked you through OnStar, and it showed me you went straight to Julie's house.
The bluff immediately paid off.
Her whole personality changed.
Then police dropped another bombshell and told Rose that Mark had already ID'd her as a possible suspect in Julie's murder. Rose looked devastated, and then she told police something they didn't expect.
When she found out that Mark had named her as the killer, all bets were off. I'm not going down for this by myself. I'm not the one that came up with this idea. I did it for him. I loved him.
According to Rose, she wasn't the jealous ex-mistress Mark had made her out to be. In fact, she claimed that they'd never broken up after reigniting their affair.
Mark Bowling loved her, she loved Mark, and they were going to have a life together.
Rose told investigators that the only change in their relationship was that their trysts had recently moved from the funeral parlor to the luxurious home Mark shared with Julie. Rose told police that as she and Mark began to see each other more frequently, they both fantasized about a life together.
They would get married and move into that home together. That's what he told her he wanted.
Rose had to think. This was supposed to be me. It was never, ever supposed to be Julie.
But Rose claimed that Mark insisted that a messy divorce would only cause him to lose his house and beloved business. Mark had confided to Rose that the only reason he'd married Julie in the first place was for her money and social status in the community. He'd needed both to build his mortuary empire. And he'd lose everything if Julie knew he was leaving her for another woman. So Mark came up with a different plan.
He
told Rose that we'd get her out of the picture, that it'd be me and you.
She said Mark gave her the gun and told her he wanted her to kill his wife.
Mark told Rose he already had it all figured out. He would go out of town to establish an alibi. Then Rose would go to the couple's home and shoot Julie as she left for work.
He told her, all you have to do is step inside, shoot her, and leave. That's all you have to do.
Rose told police she was horrified by Mark's plan, but in her heart, she also knew he was right. The only way she could ever have Mark to herself would be if Julie was out of the picture.
Rose thought this was unfair. This should be my life. This is mine.
Mark taught Rose how to shoot the handgun several times, told her how to reload if she needed to.
On the morning of December 6th, Rose put Mark's plan into action. She drove to the Bowling home, parked down the street, then waited until Julie opened her garage to leave for work.
The garage door went up. Julie was preoccupied with the mail she had in her hand and/or her keys. She came down the little flight of steps, a few steps, got to the car door, and never saw Rose.
That's when Rose stepped out of hiding.
Julie was startled and turned towards her, and apparently Julie saw her raise the gun and started to run, and Rose just started firing.
She said she heard in her mind Mark saying, "Shoot her till the gun stops." So she stood over Julie and she shot her till the gun stopped.
Rose said after it was over, she got back into her car and drove away, stopping only to get rid of the one piece of evidence linking her and Mark to the murder.
She buries the gun next to her mother's grave. Some strange symbolism there with the gun going next to the reason she knows Mark Bowling in the first place.
When you have the actual shooter confessing, that is damning. That is very damning. And it goes right along with every piece of evidence that we recovered. I mean, to the T.
Mark had started up a relationship with Rose. Did he do that from the beginning, knowing that she would be the perfect person that he could use and manipulate and get rid of his current wife? Is he that devious? It's possible.
Investigators arrested Rose and Mark, charging them with the first-degree murder of Julie Bowling.
Prosecutors said they were seeking the death penalty.
But while turning the lovers against each other in an interrogation room had worked, investigators wondered if doing it in a courtroom would be as easy. Coming up, Mark Bowling's fate comes down to a broken heart.
And I asked her point blank, Rose, are you in love with Mark?
She was starting to have second thoughts.
Rose Vincent and Mark Bowling had just been arrested and charged with the shooting death of Mark's wife, Julie. The shocking story of a sex-crazed funeral home director who'd convinced his secret lover to murder his wife had made headlines across the country.
Rose said Mark gave me the gun. Mark told me when to do it. Mark told me how to do it. Yes, I pulled the trigger, but Mark was the mastermind of this plot.
Now both lovers were facing trial and the possibility of a death sentence. But with little physical evidence tying Mark to the murder, prosecutors knew they would need Rose's help, so they decided to offer her a deal.
Instead of a death penalty, she could get a sentence of 29 years. And instead of dying in prison, one day she could walk out a free woman.
But even though Mark had given her up to police, they weren't sure whether Rose would agree to return the favor and put him behind bars.
I asked her point blank, Rose, are you in love with Mark? Yeah, I still love him, but I'm going to testify for you.
In September, Mark Bowling's trial began. Prosecutors painted a picture of a sex-driven maniac who used women to satisfy his extravagant desires.
He was perverted with his sexual lifestyle, and money was no object.
They argued that Mark had squandered his fortune on prostitutes and wild parties. Faced with losing his indulgent lifestyle, Mark planned to cash in on his wife's life insurance policy and turned to his most faithful lover for help.
He had to get rid of Julie to get the money, but he had to get somebody to do it for him, which Rose was his out.
Mark really was using her as a pawn. He had no intent whatsoever of Rose Vincent becoming Mrs. Mark Bowling.
Prosecutors argued that not only did Mark give Rose the gun, he also fed her the necessary information she would need to carry out the murder.
Rose wouldn't have known that Julie got up at 6 in the morning and had to be at work by 7, and the garage door was going to go up at 6:45. She had to be given information. She had to be helped.
To drive their point home, the prosecution called their star witness, Rose Vincent. But before Rose could testify, Mark's defense made a shocking announcement.
Mark agrees to plead guilty.
Suddenly, the defense stopped in their tracks. They realized there was no way that their client was going to be found not guilty after Rose got up in the stand.
Instead, Mark's attorneys scrambled to make a last-minute deal.
Mark Bowling would admit to his crime, and he would serve 15 to 20 years in prison.
Prosecutors agreed. But while both killers had been brought to justice, some felt his sentence was too light.
Rose got more time than he did, which I don't like that, but I have no control over that. But because he used her.
In the end, Mark's reason for killing his wife had come down to simple greed. But for Rose, the stakes had been much, much higher.
Rose would die for Mark. That's how much love she had for this guy. He just took advantage of her. He manipulated her, played with her mind, and made her do his dirty work.
This was Rose's Cinderella story. This is how she saw it. She viewed Julie as an obstacle, a barrier in her path to having the life she wanted. But like most fairy tales, this one did not have a happy ending.
Rome has always been a city where history lingers in plain sight. Ancient stone bridges cross the Tiber River much as they did centuries ago. Narrow streets wind between buildings that have witnessed the rise and fall of governments. And public squares have long served as places where ordinary people gather to celebrate, mourn, protest, or demand change. But on the evening of May 12, 1977, history was not being written inside Parliament or behind the doors of government ministries. It was unfolding in the streets, beneath clouds of tear gas, amid the echoes of shouted slogans, sirens, and sudden panic. By the end of that day, one young woman would become one of the most enduring symbols of Italy's turbulent years of lead. Her name was Georgiana Massey. She was 18 years old. The events of that evening unfolded with bewildering speed. Demonstrators filled parts of central Rome despite an official ban on public protests. Police officers, deployed in extraordinary numbers, stood throughout the city in both uniform and plain clothes. What had begun as a political gathering gradually descended into violent confrontations. Tear gas drifted through the streets. Objects were thrown. Molotov cocktails appeared. People scattered from one intersection to another as the atmosphere became increasingly unpredictable. Then, somewhere within the confusion, gunfire erupted. Exactly who fired those shots has never been established. Among those trying to leave the area was Georgiana Massey. She was not alone. Walking beside her was her boyfriend, Gianfranco Papini. Like hundreds of others, They were moving toward the Trastevere district by crossing Ponte Garibaldi, a bridge spanning the Tiber River that connected two sides of the city. Around them, people hurried away from the clashes, uncertain where danger might appear next. The bridge had become less a destination than an escape route. Then, at approximately 7:55 in the evening, Georgiana suddenly collapsed. For a brief moment, those nearby reportedly believed she had simply stumbled amid the chaos. In situations of panic, the human mind often searches for the least frightening explanation. But as people reached her, they quickly realized something far more serious had happened. She had been shot. A civilian vehicle rushed her toward the hospital. There was little else anyone could do. The injury proved fatal. Medical examination later determined that a .22 caliber bullet had entered her body from behind. Before the night was over, another statistic had been added to an already violent period of Italian history. Yet the most important question remained unanswered. Who fired the shot? Nearly half a century later, the answer is still unknown. Many criminal investigations eventually arrive at a point where evidence converges toward a single suspect. Witnesses begin to agree. Physical evidence aligns with testimony. A timeline becomes clearer. Prosecutors build a coherent narrative capable of surviving scrutiny in court. The investigation into the death of Georgiana Massey never reached that point. Instead, every path seemed to dissolve into contradiction. Some believe the fatal shot came from armed plainclothes police officers operating among the crowd. Others argued it could have been fired by armed demonstrators associated with extremist movements. Still others suggested entirely different possibilities. Each explanation carried profound political implications. Each reflected the deep divisions that had come to define Italy during one of the most unstable decades in its modern history. And yet none could be conclusively proven. That uncertainty transformed what might otherwise have been remembered as one tragic death into something much larger. The death of Georgiana Massey became a symbol. To some Italians, her death represented the dangers of excessive state power and a lack of transparency surrounding the actions of security forces. To others, it illustrated the terrible consequences of political violence itself, where ideological conflict had become so deeply embedded in everyday life that innocent people could become victims without anyone ever knowing exactly how or why. Regardless of political perspective, one fact remained beyond dispute. An 18-year-old student lost her life, and the person responsible was never identified. Cases like this occupy a unique place within true crime. Most investigations revolve around a single individual, a murderer whose motives, movements, and actions investigators attempt to reconstruct. This case resists that familiar structure. Here, the central mystery is not hidden inside a private home or an isolated crime scene. It unfolded in the middle of a public demonstration witnessed by countless people. Hundreds were present. Thousands were nearby. Police officers, protesters, journalists, and ordinary citizens all experienced different fragments of the same evening. Yet despite the number of witnesses, certainty became almost impossible. The circumstances themselves worked against clarity. The demonstration took place during a period of exceptional political tension. Emotions ran high long before the first confrontation occurred. By the time violence escalated, confusion had become almost impossible to separate from fact. Reports emerged from multiple locations. Gunfire was heard in different parts of central Rome. More than one person suffered gunshot injuries that evening. As investigators attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events, they encountered conflicting testimony, competing political narratives, and an atmosphere in which nearly every conclusion carried broader implications beyond the death itself. Perhaps that is why this case continues to attract attention decades later. It is not merely because the murder remains unsolved, although that alone would make it noteworthy. It is because the unanswered questions extend beyond the identity of a single shooter. They touch upon larger questions about trust, accountability, memory, and the difficulty of establishing objective truth when violence unfolds amid political conflict. History often records major events through dates, legislation, elections, and official statements. But sometimes history is remembered through the life of one ordinary person whose story becomes inseparable from the era in which it occurred. Georgiana Massey was not a government official, a military commander, or the leader of a political movement. She was a final-year high school student. She had interests, beliefs, and hopes common to many young people of her generation. Yet on one spring evening in Rome, her name became permanently linked to one of Italy's most enduring political mysteries. The years that followed would bring investigations, accusations, renewed inquiries, and public debate. Photographs would be examined. Witnesses would offer differing accounts. Competing theories would emerge, each supported by some and rejected by others. Files would eventually be closed, only to be revisited again years later. But through every development, one painful reality remained unchanged. No court would identify the person who fired the fatal bullet. No definitive forensic evidence would establish the murder weapon. No final verdict would explain exactly what happened on Ponte Garibaldi that evening. This is the story of a young woman whose death became far more than an unsolved homicide. It is the story of a nation living through one of its most turbulent chapters, of a demonstration that ended in tragedy, of an investigation that never reached certainty, and of a question that continues to echo through Italian history. Who killed Georgiana Massey? To this day, no one can answer that question with certainty. Long before her name became associated with one of Italy's most enduring unsolved political killings, Georgiana Massey was simply another young woman growing up in Rome. She was born on August 6, 1958, into a country experiencing extraordinary political and social transformation. By the time she reached her late teenage years, Italy had become a nation where conversations about democracy, civil rights, political identity, and the role of the state were no longer confined to newspapers or parliamentary debates. Those discussions had spilled into universities, public squares, workplaces, and eventually into the streets themselves. Like many young people of her generation, Georgiana came of age during a period in which politics was not an abstract concept, but an unavoidable part of everyday life. At the time of her death, Georgiana was only 18 years old and in her final year of high school. There is nothing in the available historical record to suggest that she occupied any prominent public position or held any significant political office. She was neither a nationally recognized activist nor the leader of an organization. Instead, she represented a generation of students whose lives unfolded against the backdrop of intense ideological conflict. She had shown an interest in feminist causes and was sympathetic toward the Radical Party, a political movement that advocated for civil liberties and democratic reforms. Those sympathies reflected her personal convictions, but they did not make her an exceptional figure within the broader landscape of Italian youth during the 1970s. Many students participated in discussions about politics, attended public meetings, or supported causes they believed would shape the country's future. Understanding Georgiana's life requires understanding the Italy into which she was born. During the 1970s, the country experienced a period that later became known as the Years of Lead, or anni di piombo. The phrase evokes the image of bullets, violence, and a society weighed down by fear. It refers to an era characterized by frequent political clashes involving extremist organizations for both the far left and the far right, as well as confrontations with the state's security forces. Violence became an increasingly familiar feature of public life. Political disagreements that might once have been settled through debate often escalated into physical conflict, and demonstrations sometimes ended in bloodshed. This atmosphere influenced nearly every aspect of Italian society. Public trust became strained as competing political groups accused one another of fueling instability. The actions of extremist organizations heightened public anxiety, while the government's efforts to maintain order often generated controversy of their own. Citizens found themselves navigating a country where ordinary routines could suddenly be interrupted by protests, police operations, or outbreaks of violence. For many Italians, uncertainty became a defining characteristic of everyday existence. Rome, as the nation's capital, naturally stood at the center of these tensions. Government institutions, political parties, universities, and activist organizations all operated within the city. Demonstrations frequently took place in its streets and public squares. Every gathering had the potential to become a stage upon which larger national conflicts were played out. Protests were no longer viewed merely as expressions of opinion. They increasingly became moments where different visions of Italy confronted one another directly. By 1977, those tensions had intensified further. Throughout the year, clashes between students and police occurred repeatedly in Rome. Demonstrations reflected growing frustration among various political movements, while authorities struggled to maintain public order. Each new confrontation deepened mistrust between protesters and security forces. Every violent incident left behind questions that extended beyond the immediate events themselves. One particular event significantly altered the government's approach to public demonstrations. On April 21, 1977, during one of these confrontations, police officer Settimio Passamani was killed. His death shocked the country and reinforced official concerns that public protests had become increasingly dangerous. In response, the Ministry of the Interior imposed a ban on public demonstrations in Rome for several weeks. Authorities believed that restricting large gatherings would help prevent further violence and restore stability to the capital. The responsibility for implementing these measures rested with Interior Minister Francesco Cossiga, one of the most prominent and controversial political figures of the period. As head of the Interior Ministry, Cossiga faced the difficult task of balancing public security with democratic freedoms. Supporters viewed strong security measures as necessary responses to escalating unrest. Critics argued that such policies risked limiting fundamental civil liberties, particularly the right to assemble and protest peacefully. These disagreements formed part of a much broader national debate about the appropriate relationship between state authority and individual freedom during periods of political crisis. Against this backdrop, every public gathering acquired heightened significance. A demonstration was no longer simply a political event. It also represented a test of government policy, public order, and the willingness of citizens to challenge official restrictions. Decisions made by organizers and authorities alike carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate purpose of any single event. It was within this tense political environment that the Radical Party announced a public gathering for May 12, 1977. The decision itself was controversial because the ban on demonstrations remained in effect. Nevertheless, the organizers proceeded with plans for the event. Their stated objectives were specific and publicly declared. They intended to commemorate the third anniversary of the successful referendum that had preserved divorce rights in Italy, collect signatures supporting new referendum initiatives, and protest security measures that they believed restricted political freedoms. These objectives reflected issues of democratic participation rather than calls for violence. The gathering sought to combine celebration, civic engagement, and political criticism. Yet the broader circumstances surrounding the event meant that even peaceful intentions could not eliminate the possibility of confrontation. Authorities anticipated potential disorder, while participants knew they were assembling despite an official prohibition. As May 12th approached, both sides prepared accordingly. Approximately 5,000 police officers and security personnel would eventually be deployed throughout central Rome. Their presence reflected the government's expectation that maintaining order would require extraordinary resources. Uniformed officers were visible throughout the city, but they were not alone. Plainclothes officers were also assigned to operate within the crowds. At the time, this deployment formed part of the broader security strategy. Only later would the presence of armed plainclothes personnel become one of the most debated aspects of the day's events. For ordinary participants, however, the day likely began with intentions far removed from the tragedy that would eventually unfold. Individuals arrived for different reasons. Some wished to commemorate an important political victory. Others wanted to support proposed referendums. Still others sought to express disagreement with recent government policies. Each person brought personal beliefs and expectations to the gathering, but none could know how dramatically the situation would evolve before sunset. Among those present was Georgiana Massey. She was not entering a battlefield. She was attending a public demonstration organized around political causes she sympathized with. Nothing contained within the documented historical record indicates that she was armed or preparing for violence. She was simply one participant among many thousands moving through the streets of Rome during an exceptionally tense period in Italian history. Looking back today, it is tempting to interpret every decision through the knowledge of what eventually occurred. Knowing the outcome, one might wonder whether anyone sensed the danger before the demonstration began, or whether participants understood how fragile the situation had become. Yet history rarely provides such certainty. The available facts tell us only that the gathering proceeded despite the official ban, that extensive police deployments had already been arranged, and that the city remained deeply divided by the political tensions of the era. The significance of Georgiana Massey's story lies precisely in that ordinary beginning. She was not famous before May 12, 1977. She did not expect to become part of Italian history. She was an 18-year-old student living through an extraordinary period, participating in a public event shaped by the political realities of her time. Her life reflected the hopes, convictions, and everyday experiences of countless young Italians who believed that public participation remained an important part of democratic society. Yet history often changes through moments that no one anticipates. The demonstration scheduled for May 12th would begin with declared political objectives and an unprecedented security presence. As the hours passed, however, the fragile balance between public assembly and public order would begin to unravel. What started as a gathering intended to mark democratic participation would gradually transform into an evening defined by confrontation, confusion, and violence. Before the day was over, the name Georgiana Massey would become inseparable from one of the greatest unresolved mysteries of Italy's years of lead. The morning of May 12, 1977, began beneath a sky that gave little indication of the tragedy the day would eventually hold. Rome awakened as it always had, with traffic gradually filling its streets, cafes opening their doors, and people following familiar routines. Yet beneath the appearance of normality, the city was preparing for an event that authorities already regarded with deep concern. The official ban on public demonstrations remained in force, a direct consequence of the escalating violence that had marked recent weeks. Even so, members and supporters of the Radical Party intended to gather in the historic center of the capital. Their objectives had been publicly announced: to commemorate the third anniversary of the successful referendum that had preserved divorce rights in Italy, to collect signatures for future referendum campaigns, and to protest security measures that they believed limited political freedoms. These aims reflected political participation rather than violence. But the atmosphere surrounding the event was shaped by suspicion long before the first demonstrators arrived. Authorities responded with an extraordinary security operation. Approximately 5,000 police officers and security personnel were deployed throughout Central Rome. Uniformed officers occupied major intersections, public squares, and strategic locations where large crowds were expected to assemble. Their presence was impossible to ignore. For participants, every approach to the demonstration passed under the watchful eyes of law enforcement. Yet the visible police presence represented only part of the security arrangements. Plainclothes officers also operated among the crowds. At the time, their role formed part of the broader effort to monitor developments as they unfolded. Only later would their presence become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case, raising questions that investigators and historians would continue to debate for decades. As people gathered throughout the city, the demonstration initially unfolded without reports of major violence. Individuals arrived carrying different expectations. Some wished to celebrate a political achievement they considered an important milestone for civil rights. Others hoped to support future referendum initiatives by adding their signatures. Many were motivated by opposition to government restrictions on public assembly. While opinions differed, participants shared the experience of assembling in defiance of an official prohibition. That fact alone made the gathering politically significant. For several hours, the demonstration remained relatively orderly. Crowds moved through the streets, conversations took place, and the city witnessed yet another expression of the intense political engagement that characterized Italy during the years of Lead. Yet beneath this outward calm, the possibility of confrontation remained ever present. The combination of large crowds, heightened political emotions, and extensive police deployment created an environment in which even a small incident had the potential to escalate rapidly. As the afternoon progressed, that fragile balance began to deteriorate. Reports from different areas of central Rome described growing confrontations between demonstrators and police. What had started as a public gathering gradually transformed into a series of increasingly tense encounters. Security forces responded by deploying tear gas in an effort to disperse crowds and regain control of affected areas. The use of tear gas altered the atmosphere almost instantly. Streets that had moments earlier been filled with chanting and conversation became scenes of confusion. Visibility decreased as gas drifted through public squares and narrow streets. Demonstrators hurried to escape its effects while others attempted to regroup. The orderly movement of people gave way to hurried retreats and scattered clusters of individuals, searching for safer routes through the city. At the same time, violence emerged from within parts of the crowd. Molotov cocktails were thrown. Other objects were hurled toward security forces. These actions intensified the confrontation and further complicated efforts to distinguish peaceful demonstrators from those participating in violent acts. The city became fragmented into multiple areas of conflict rather than one clearly defined scene. News of disturbances spread quickly from one location to another, often outpacing reliable information about what was actually happening. Among the areas affected were Piazza Navona and the vicinity of Ponte Garibaldi. These locations would later become central to the investigation because reports of gunfire emerged from both areas during the escalating clashes. Witnesses described hearing shots amid the confusion, though the precise sequence of events proved extraordinarily difficult to reconstruct. In an environment filled with shouting, explosions from tear gas canisters, and the sounds of objects striking the pavement, identifying the origin of individual gunshots became an almost impossible task. By early evening, the atmosphere had changed completely from that of the morning gathering. Instead of organized political activity, the priority for many people became leaving the area safely. Demonstrators dispersed in different directions, seeking routes away from the clashes. Police continued efforts to control the situation while uncertainty spread through the streets. Those caught in the middle often possessed only fragmentary knowledge of events occurring beyond their immediate surroundings. It was during this period of retreat that Georgiana Massey found herself moving toward Ponte Garibaldi. She was accompanied by her boyfriend, Gianfranco Papini. Like many others, they were heading toward the Trastevere district by crossing the bridge. The available historical record does not describe hurried conversations between them or reveal what they may have been thinking in those moments. It tells us only that they were among the people attempting to leave an increasingly dangerous situation behind. Around them, crowds continued to move away from the areas where clashes had taken place. Some people walked quickly. Others looked back repeatedly, uncertain whether additional confrontations might erupt behind them. The sounds of unrest had not entirely disappeared. The uncertainty that accompanies public disorder remained present even as people attempted to distance themselves from it. Then, at approximately 7:55 p.m., everything changed. Without warning, Georgiana Massey collapsed. For those standing nearby, the moment appears to have been one of immediate confusion rather than instant understanding. According to witness accounts, several people initially believed she had simply fallen. Amid the disorder of the evening, stumbling or losing one's balance would not have seemed unusual. Only when others approached her did they recognize the true nature of what had happened. She had been struck by a bullet. The realization transformed confusion into urgency. There was no time to determine where the shot had originated or who might have fired it. The immediate concern became saving her life. Rather than waiting for emergency services, those nearby placed Georgiana into a civilian vehicle and transported her toward the hospital as quickly as possible. The decision reflected the desperate circumstances of the moment. Every passing minute carried enormous weight. Despite those efforts, the injuries proved fatal. Georgiana Massey died shortly afterward. Subsequent medical examination established one critical fact that would remain undisputed throughout every stage of the investigation. The fatal projectile was a .22 caliber bullet, and it had entered her body from behind. This forensic finding became one of the few elements of the case that investigators could regard with certainty. Yet even this confirmed fact failed to answer the question that mattered most. Knowing the caliber of the bullet and its direction of travel did not reveal who had fired it or from precisely where the shot had come. Her death was not the only shooting reported that evening. Historical records indicate that other individuals also suffered gunshot injuries during the same period of unrest. This broader context complicated the investigation from its earliest stages. Investigators were no longer examining a single isolated shooting, but attempting to reconstruct events within an environment where multiple firearms may have been discharged amid widespread confusion. As darkness settled over Rome, uncertainty began replacing immediate chaos. The physical confrontation gradually came to an end, but another, more enduring conflict had already begun. Questions emerged almost immediately regarding responsibility for the shooting. Different interpretations of the day's events circulated among political organizations, government officials, journalists, and witnesses. The available evidence was incomplete. Individual observations often contradicted one another. Every attempt to establish a clear sequence of events encountered obstacles created by the complexity of the demonstration itself. One fact, however, became impossible to ignore. An 18-year-old high school student who had attended a political demonstration was dead. The circumstances surrounding her death quickly transformed the incident from a tragic casualty of civil unrest into a matter of national concern. The shooting had occurred in public, in the presence of large numbers of demonstrators and security personnel. Thousands of people had been in the city that evening. Yet despite the number of potential witnesses, no immediate consensus emerged regarding the identity of the shooter. Instead, uncertainty became the defining feature of the case from its very first hours. Investigators faced a scene unlike that of a conventional homicide. There was no controlled crime scene preserved immediately after the shooting. The events had unfolded across busy public streets during an ongoing confrontation involving thousands of people. Evidence was scattered across multiple locations. Witnesses had observed different portions of the evening from different perspectives. Gunfire had reportedly been heard in more than one area. Distinguishing between direct observation and later interpretation would become one of the investigation's greatest challenges. Even before formal investigative procedures had fully begun, competing narratives were already taking shape. Some focused attention on the presence of armed plainclothes officers among the crowds. Others argued that armed extremists within the demonstration itself could have been responsible. Still others urged caution, insisting that the available facts remained too limited to support any definitive conclusion. These competing explanations would shape public discussion for decades, long after the physical evidence had been examined. The tragedy on Ponte Garibaldi marked the end of Giorgiana Massey's life. But it marked only the beginning of one of Italy's most enduring unsolved investigations. What had occurred during those final moments remained obscured by confusion, political division, and the absence of conclusive evidence. The questions raised on the evening of May 12, 1977, would outlive the demonstration itself, continuing to challenge investigators, historians, and the Italian public for generations. The moment the violence subsided on the evening of May 12, 1977, a new and equally difficult struggle began. The clashes in the streets of Rome had ended, but the search for answers had only just begun. For investigators, the challenge was unlike that of an ordinary homicide. There was no isolated crime scene protected by police tape, no quiet neighborhood where detectives could carefully reconstruct every movement, and no single sequence of events witnessed identically by everyone present. Instead, the shooting had occurred in the middle of a political demonstration involving thousands of people, during a period of escalating confrontation between protesters and security forces. The city itself had become the crime scene, and within that enormous, chaotic environment, the truth proved remarkably difficult to isolate. From the earliest hours of the investigation, one fact stood beyond dispute. Giorgiana Massey had died after being struck by a .22 caliber bullet that entered her body from behind. Medical examination established this point with certainty, giving investigators one reliable piece of physical evidence. Yet almost every question beyond that remained unanswered. Knowing the caliber of the bullet did not reveal the identity of the weapon. Knowing the direction from which the bullet entered did not identify the shooter. Even determining the precise location from which the shot had been fired proved extraordinarily complicated because of the confusion that surrounded the demonstration. Unlike crimes committed in controlled environments, the fatal shooting took place while crowds were dispersing from violent confrontations. Throughout the afternoon and evening, demonstrators had moved repeatedly through different streets of central Rome. Police units had also repositioned themselves in response to changing conditions. Tear gas had reduced visibility in some areas. Reports indicated that gunfire had been heard in multiple locations, including around Piazza Navona and Ponte Garibaldi. Other individuals had suffered gunshot injuries during the same period. These circumstances created enormous difficulties for anyone attempting to establish a complete and reliable timeline. Witness testimony quickly became one of the investigation's greatest challenges. Hundreds of people had been present near Ponte Garibaldi, while thousands more had participated in events throughout the city that day. Yet observing an event and accurately reconstructing it later are not the same thing. Every witness experienced only a limited portion of the demonstration. Some focused on police movements. Others paid attention to demonstrators nearby. Many were occupied simply with avoiding tear gas or escaping the violence. By the time investigators began collecting statements, memories reflected not only what individuals had seen, but also the confusion and fear they had experienced while events unfolded. As testimony accumulated, contradictions inevitably appeared. Different people described different sequences of events. Some remembered hearing isolated gunshots, while others believed several shots had been fired. Individuals standing only short distances apart sometimes recalled the same moments in different ways. Such inconsistencies are common in investigations involving chaotic public events. But in this case, they significantly complicated efforts to determine responsibility. Without a clear and consistent narrative supported by multiple independent witnesses, investigators struggled to identify a definitive path forward. Almost immediately after the shooting, public debate began focusing on one of the most controversial aspects of the demonstration: the presence of plainclothes police officers operating among the crowds. It was already known that security arrangements for May 12th had included not only uniformed officers, but also personnel dressed in civilian clothing. During the demonstration, these officers have been deployed throughout central Rome as part of the broader security operation. Their presence alone did not initially attract widespread attention. However, following Georgiana's death, accusations emerged suggesting that armed plainclothes officers might have been involved in the shooting. These accusations came from several activists, as well as members and supporters of the Radical Party. They argued that responsibility for the fatal shot should be examined in light of the security forces deployment that day. Their concerns intensified after photographs taken during the demonstration became public. Those images appeared to show individuals dressed in civilian clothing while carrying firearms in the areas where unrest had occurred. The photographs rapidly became some of the most discussed pieces of evidence connected to the case. To many observers, the images seemed significant because they confirmed the presence of armed plainclothes personnel during the demonstration. They raised questions about who those individuals were, what specific responsibilities they had been assigned, and whether any of them had discharged their weapons during the confrontation. For critics of the government's handling of the demonstration, the photographs appeared to support suspicions that security forces had operated in ways not fully disclosed to the public. Among the most prominent voices advancing these concerns was Marco Pannella, leader of the Radical Party. He repeatedly argued that the authorities bore responsibility for Georgiana Massey's death. His accusations reflected the broader distrust that had developed between many political activists and state institutions during the years of lead. For supporters of this interpretation, the photographs and the known deployment of plainclothes officers raised questions that demanded further investigation. Yet despite the intensity of these accusations, one crucial fact remained unchanged throughout the judicial process. No court established that any plainclothes officer fired the fatal shot. The available evidence did not conclusively identify a specific individual as the shooter, nor did it legally prove that security personnel were responsible for Georgiana's death. Suspicion and proof remained two very different things, and investigators were unable to bridge that gap with definitive evidence. While accusations against plainclothes officers attracted significant public attention, they were not the only explanation considered during the investigation. The government presented a different interpretation. Interior Minister Francesco Cossiga firmly rejected accusations directed toward the police. Instead, He argued that the fatal bullet may have originated from armed extremists within the demonstration itself. According to this explanation, members of the far-left movement Autonomia Opraya or other armed demonstrators could have fired the shot. Under this theory, Georgiana Massey would have become the victim of what might be described as friendly fire, a tragic accident caused not by state security forces, but by armed individuals participating in the protest. This explanation reflected the broader context of political violence that characterized Italy during the years of lead. Authorities emphasized that extremist groups had contributed significantly to the atmosphere of instability across the country. From this perspective, it was considered plausible that armed militants present among demonstrators could have discharged firearms during the clashes. However, just as accusations against plainclothes officers remained unproven, so too did this official explanation. Investigators were unable to identify any individual from Autonomia Opraya or any other demonstrator as the confirmed shooter. No forensic evidence directly connected the fatal bullet to a weapon carried by a protester. Consequently, the theory remained exactly that, a theory supported by official statements, but never conclusively demonstrated through judicial findings. As the years passed, additional speculation emerged from other quarters. Some later allegations suggested that far-right extremists or individuals associated with neo-fascist organizations might have played a role in the shooting. These suggestions reflected the extraordinarily complex political landscape of Italy during the period, when violence originating from multiple ideological directions contributed to widespread public uncertainty. Nevertheless, these allegations also encountered the same fundamental obstacle that had frustrated every previous theory. They lacked sufficient legal evidence. No investigation succeeded in producing reliable proof connecting far-right extremists to Georgiana's death, without corroborating forensic evidence or testimony capable of meeting judicial standards. These claims remained speculative and did not result in criminal prosecutions. As investigators examined these competing possibilities, they also pursued more traditional forensic approaches. Because the bullet recovered from Georgiana was identified as .22 caliber, attention naturally turned toward firearms of that caliber that had been seized from various extremist organizations over subsequent years. Ballistics experts conducted examinations in an effort to determine whether any known weapon matched the projectile responsible for the fatal shot. This process represented one of the most concrete investigative efforts undertaken after the shooting. If investigators could identify the weapon, they might then trace its ownership, determine who possessed it on May 12, 1977, and perhaps finally identify the individual responsible. But the results proved disappointing. Despite examining numerous .22 caliber firearms recovered during investigations into extremist activities, experts failed to identify the murder weapon. None of the ballistic examinations established a definitive match between the fatal bullet and any firearm available to investigators. Without the weapon itself, one of the most important avenues toward solving the case reached another dead end. The absence of the murder weapon had consequences far beyond forensic science. It meant investigators could not reconstruct the precise chain of possession, determine where the firearm had been before or after the shooting, or compare additional ballistic evidence that might have strengthened one theory over another. Every unresolved question surrounding the weapon widened the space in which competing interpretations continued to exist. The investigation gradually became defined not by discoveries, but by limitations. There was no confirmed shooter, no identified murder weapon, no uncontested eyewitness account, no forensic evidence sufficient to eliminate every competing theory. Instead, investigators repeatedly encountered the same obstacles, contradictory testimony, incomplete physical evidence, and a political environment in which nearly every interpretation carried broader implications beyond the homicide itself. Years passed without a definitive breakthrough. In 1981, the investigation reached a major turning point. Unable to identify the individual responsible, authorities closed the case without prosecuting anyone. Legally, the investigation had exhausted the evidence available at the time. Closing the file did not mean that every question had been answered. Rather, it reflected the opposite. Investigators simply lacked sufficient evidence to proceed toward criminal charges. Yet even closing the case failed to end public interest. The unanswered questions surrounding Georgiana Massey's death continued to resonate throughout Italian society. Her case remained a source of debate for journalists, historians, political figures, and ordinary citizens alike. The photographs of armed, plainclothes officers continued to attract attention. Official explanations continued to be questioned. Competing interpretations survived because none had ever been conclusively disproven or conclusively proven. More than a decade later, investigators returned to the case once again. In 1998, prosecutors reopened aspects of the investigation after new witness testimony emerged. Once again, hopes briefly surfaced that additional information might finally resolve the mystery that had persisted for more than 20 years. Those hopes ultimately faded. Although investigators reviewed the new testimony carefully, the additional evidence proved insufficient to identify a suspect or support criminal charges. The reopening ended much as the original investigation had ended, with uncertainty. By that point, the central mystery had become painfully clear. The available facts established that Georgiana Massey had been shot and killed while leaving a political demonstration on May 12, 1977. They established the caliber of the bullet. They established that it entered from behind. They established that armed plainclothes officers were present in the area. They established that multiple theories existed regarding responsibility. What they never established was the identity of the person who pulled the trigger. For investigators, that absence of certainty became the defining characteristic of the entire case. Every documented fact illuminated part of the story while leaving its central question unanswered. Nearly 5 decades later, the investigation into Georgiana Massey's death remains one of Italy's most enduring examples of how political violence, public disorder, conflicting testimony, and incomplete evidence can combine to place the truth permanently beyond reach. By the time investigators reached the early years of the new decade, one reality had become increasingly difficult to ignore. The death of Georgiana Massey had generated enormous public attention, intense political debate, and countless competing interpretations. Yet the criminal investigation itself had produced remarkably few definitive answers. The questions that had emerged on the evening of May 12, 1977, remained almost exactly where they had begun. Investigators knew that an 18-year-old high school student had been fatally shot while leaving a political demonstration in Rome. They knew that the fatal projectile was a .22 caliber bullet that entered her body from behind. They knew that the shooting had occurred during a day marked by violent clashes between demonstrators and security forces. Beyond those established facts, certainty steadily gave way to uncertainty. For prosecutors, the legal challenge was fundamentally different from the political debate unfolding outside the courtroom. Public opinion can be influenced by suspicion, by photographs, by historical context, or by deeply held beliefs about the conduct of governments and political movements. Criminal proceedings, however, require something far more demanding. Every accusation must ultimately rest upon evidence capable of identifying an individual beyond speculation. It is not enough for a theory to appear plausible. It must be supported by evidence strong enough to withstand judicial examination. In the investigation into Georgiana Massey's death, that level of proof never emerged. As investigators reviewed witness statements, ballistic examinations, and the various theories surrounding the shooting, they repeatedly encountered the same obstacle. No single line of evidence connected all the necessary pieces. Witness testimony remained inconsistent. The murder weapon could not be identified, although photographs confirmed the presence of armed, plainclothes officers during the demonstration. They did not establish that any specific officer had fired the fatal shot. Likewise, the official theory suggesting that armed demonstrators may have been responsible could not be substantiated through definitive forensic or testimonial evidence. Every investigative path eventually reached a point where assumptions exceeded provable facts. This distinction between suspicion and proof became the defining feature of the judicial process. Many high-profile criminal cases eventually move toward indictments because investigators are able to narrow their focus to one suspect or a small group of suspects. In the Georgiana Massey investigation, no such progression occurred. Rather than moving steadily toward greater certainty, the available evidence remained fragmented. Every explanation left essential questions unanswered. Every theory encountered significant evidentiary limitations. The legal system therefore confronted a difficult but unavoidable reality. Without sufficient evidence identifying an individual responsible for the shooting, prosecution could not proceed. In 1981, for years after Georgiana's death, authorities formally closed the investigation. The decision did not represent a declaration that the mystery had been solved, nor did it signify that investigators had determined no crime had occurred. On the contrary, the closure acknowledged that a homicide had taken place, but that the available evidence was insufficient to identify and prosecute the person responsible. No individual was charged with murder. No defendant stood trial. No courtroom heard a complete reconstruction of the shooting supported by conclusive evidence. The judicial process reached its limit not because every question had been answered, but because, too, many critical questions remained unresolved. For Georgiana's family, for those who had attended the demonstration, and for many members of the Italian public, the closing of the investigation could not provide the sense of resolution that often accompanies a completed criminal case. There was no verdict explaining exactly what had happened on Ponte Garibaldi. There was no judicial finding assigning responsibility to any individual or institution. Instead, the legal record preserved uncertainty itself. Yet the closure of the case did not silence public discussion. On the contrary, the absence of a definitive judicial conclusion allowed competing interpretations to continue developing. Supporters of different theories pointed to the same body of evidence while drawing very different conclusions. Those who believed that armed plainclothes officers had fired the fatal shot argued that the investigation had failed to fully address troubling questions surrounding the security operation conducted that day. Others continued to support the official explanation that armed extremists within the demonstration could have been responsible. Additional speculation involving far-right extremists also persisted in some discussions. Despite the lack of sufficient legal evidence supporting that possibility, the legal system, however, remained bound by standards of proof rather than political interpretation. Regardless of how strongly different groups believed in one explanation or another, the courts required evidence capable of establishing criminal responsibility. That evidence never materialized. Even after the official closure of the investigation, authorities did not entirely abandon the possibility that new information might someday emerge. Over the years, investigators continued examining available evidence whenever potentially significant developments arose. One of the most important of these occurred in 1998, more than 20 years after the shooting. By then, Italy itself had changed considerably. The years of lead had long since ended, and the country had entered a different political era. Nevertheless, the death of Georgiana Massey continued to occupy a unique place in the nation's historical memory. New witness testimony prompted prosecutors to revisit aspects of the case in the hope that previously unavailable information might finally clarify what had happened on May 12, 1977. The reopening reflected an important principle within criminal justice. Closing an investigation does not necessarily prevent authorities from reconsidering a case if credible new evidence becomes available. Particularly in unresolved homicides, investigators often remain willing to review additional testimony or forensic material whenever there is a realistic possibility that it could alter previous conclusions. In Georgiana's case, prosecutors carefully examined the new statements that had emerged. For a time, there was renewed hope that the investigation might finally move beyond the impasse that had persisted since the late 1970s. Perhaps overlooked details would now fit together differently. Perhaps the passage of time had encouraged witnesses to speak more openly. Perhaps information unavailable during the original investigation would finally identify the individual responsible. Those hopes ultimately proved unsuccessful. After reviewing the additional testimony, prosecutors concluded that the new material remained insufficient to support criminal charges. Although the information warranted examination, it did not overcome the evidentiary problems that had prevented prosecution years earlier. No suspect could be identified with the level of certainty required by law. No new forensic discovery connected a particular weapon to the fatal bullet. No witness account resolved the fundamental contradictions that had characterized the case from the beginning. As a result, the renewed investigation ended without indictments. The official legal status of the case, therefore, remained unchanged. Georgiana Massey's death continued to be classified as an unsolved homicide. This outcome carries important legal significance. An unsolved homicide is not a case in which responsibility has been assigned but punishment avoided. It is a case in which investigators have established that a criminal act occurred while remaining unable to identify, with sufficient legal certainty, the person who committed it. That distinction is essential. The absence of a conviction should never be interpreted as proof supporting any particular theory. Instead, it reflects the limitations of the available evidence. For historians, journalists, and legal scholars, the judicial history of the case illustrates the often difficult relationship between historical events and legal proof. Political controversies can generate enormous quantities of public discussion, but courts must evaluate evidence according to strict procedural standards. The Georgiana Massey investigation demonstrates how those standards can leave even the most widely discussed cases unresolved when conclusive evidence cannot be obtained. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the judicial outcome is what never occurred. There was never a murder trial in which prosecutors presented a complete narrative identifying the killer. There was never a defense attempting to rebut accusations against a named defendant. There was never a verdict establishing guilt or innocence. Instead, the courtroom remained largely absent from the final chapter of the legal process. The investigation concluded before it could evolve into the kind of trial that often provides society with formal answers to difficult questions. The silence left by that absence has endured for decades. Every year that passes without new evidence reinforces the extraordinary nature of the case. Most criminal investigations eventually arrive at one of two destinations. Either investigators identify a suspect and proceed through the judicial system, or they establish that no crime occurred. The death of Georgiana Massey reached neither conclusion. The homicide itself is undisputed. The identity of the killer remains unknown. In that sense, the judicial outcome mirrors the investigation as a whole. The legal process confirmed certain facts while leaving its central question unanswered. An 18-year-old student lost her life during a political demonstration in Rome. Extensive investigations followed. Multiple theories were examined. Ballistic testing was conducted. Witnesses were interviewed. The case was reviewed again years later after new testimony emerged. Yet despite every effort, no court was ever able to answer the question that had first arisen on the evening of May 12, 1977. Who fired the shot that killed Georgiana Massey? The judicial system could not say. Nearly half a century later, its official answer remains exactly as it was when the investigation ultimately came to an end. The homicide is unsolved. No one has been prosecuted, and the identity of the shooter has never been established. Nearly half a century has passed since the evening of May 12, 1977. Yet the death of Georgiana Massey continues to occupy a unique place in Italy's collective memory. Many criminal cases gradually fade from public consciousness as years become decades. Their details remembered only within legal archives or specialized historical studies. The story of Georgiana Massey has followed a different path. Although the investigation never identified the person responsible for her death, her name has remained present in public discussion because the questions surrounding her case have never truly disappeared. Each anniversary serves as a reminder not only of an unsolved homicide, but also of one of the most turbulent periods in modern Italian history, when political conflict reached into the everyday lives of ordinary citizens and transformed public spaces into places of uncertainty. Every year on May 12th, people continue to gather in Rome to remember Georgiana Massey. The commemorations are acts of remembrance rather than legal proceedings. They cannot answer the questions left unresolved by investigators, nor can they replace the evidence that was never found. Instead, they preserve the memory of an 18-year-old student whose life ended before adulthood had truly begun. The passage of time has altered the political landscape of Italy. Governments have changed. Generations have grown up knowing the years of lead only through history books. And the streets where the demonstration unfolded have returned to the rhythms of ordinary life. Yet the act of remembrance continues because unresolved tragedies often become part of a nation's historical identity in ways that solved cases do not. One reason the case continues to resonate is that Georgiana Massey herself has come to symbolize different things to different people. Historical memory is rarely uniform, particularly when events occur during periods of political division. For many Italians, Georgiana became a symbol of concerns about state power and institutional transparency. Those who hold this perspective often point to the unresolved questions surrounding the deployment of armed plainclothes officers during the demonstration and argue that the inability to determine exactly what occurred has left an enduring gap in public trust. In their view, the significance of the case extends beyond the death of a single individual to broader questions about accountability whenever governments exercise extraordinary security measures. Others remember the case differently. Rather than focusing primarily on the conduct of state institutions, they see Georgiana as one of the many innocent victims caught within an era dominated by political extremism and violence. From this perspective, the tragedy illustrates the devastating consequences of a society in which ideological conflict had become so intense that ordinary citizens could lose their lives during public demonstrations. The emphasis is not placed upon one specific theory regarding the fatal shot, but upon the broader reality that violence had become deeply embedded within public life during the years of lead. These differing interpretations have existed side by side for decades. Importantly, neither perspective changes the facts established through the investigation. The official record continues to identify Georgiana Massey as the victim of an unsolved homicide. Competing historical interpretations reflect different understandings of the political environment in which the shooting occurred. but they do not alter the legal conclusion that the identity of the shooter remains unknown. That distinction is essential. Historical memory often accommodates multiple interpretations, whereas criminal justice depends upon demonstrable evidence. The investigation into Georgiana's death never produced sufficient evidence to resolve the competing narratives with certainty. This unresolved status has contributed significantly to the lasting impact of the case. In many criminal investigations, public attention gradually diminishes once a conviction is secured or a definitive explanation is established. Here, no such conclusion exists. The absence of certainty has allowed the case to remain open within public memory, even though the legal investigation has long since reached its limits. Historians continue to examine the available evidence. Journalists revisit the events of May 12, 1977. Documentary programs and public discussions return periodically to the same central question. Yet every examination ultimately arrives at the same point reached by investigators decades earlier. There's still no definitive answer. The enduring mystery rests upon several unresolved issues that have never been reconciled. The murder weapon was never identified despite ballistic examinations of numerous .22 caliber firearms seized from various extremist organizations. Without the weapon, investigators could not establish a direct connection between the fatal bullet and any specific individual. The person who fired the shot has likewise never been identified. No witness account, forensic discovery, or later investigation has produced evidence sufficient to support criminal charges. The presence of armed, plainclothes officers during the demonstration remains documented. But documentation of their presence alone does not establish responsibility for the shooting. Witness testimony, gathered amid the confusion of violent street clashes, frequently conflicted with other accounts. Finally, every aspect of the investigation unfolded against the extraordinary political tensions of years of lead, when competing ideological narratives often shaped public interpretation of events as strongly as the available evidence itself. Together, these unresolved elements explain why the case continues to resist simple conclusions. Each unanswered question reinforces the others. Without the weapon, the shooter cannot be identified through ballistic comparison. Without a confirmed shooter, competing theories remain impossible to eliminate entirely. Without consistent eyewitness testimony, investigators cannot reconstruct the precise sequence of events beyond the basic facts already established. The result is a case defined not by what investigators proved, but by what they could never determine. For students of criminal investigation, the case illustrates the limitations of even determined investigative efforts when evidence is incomplete. Modern audiences often expect every major crime eventually to be solved through forensic science or newly discovered evidence. The investigation into Georgiana Massey's death reminds us that reality does not always conform to those expectations. Some crimes occur under circumstances so chaotic that critical evidence is lost before it can ever be collected. Some investigations are complicated by the passage of time, conflicting testimony, and the absence of decisive physical proof. Even persistent efforts, repeated reviews, and renewed examinations may ultimately fail to bridge the gap between suspicion and certainty. The case also serves as a reminder that victims should never disappear beneath the weight of political controversy. Discussions about the years of lead often focus on governments, political organizations, security policies, and ideological conflict. Those broader historical themes are undeniably important. Yet the center of this story remains a young woman whose life ended abruptly on a bridge in Rome, before her name appeared in newspapers or historical accounts. Georgiana Massey was a final-year high school student with interests, convictions, and a future that extended beyond the political divisions surrounding her. Regardless of how one interprets the larger historical context, that personal loss remains the most immediate and undeniable consequence of the events of May 12, 1977. There's a natural human desire to believe that every mystery eventually yields an answer. Courts deliver verdicts. Investigators uncover forgotten evidence. Witnesses come forward with decisive testimony. Families receive long-awaited closure. The story of Georgiana Massey challenges that expectation. Decades of investigation, public debate, and renewed inquiry have not produced the certainty that many hoped would one day emerge. Instead, the case demonstrates that some chapters of history remain incomplete, not because people stopped searching for answers, but because the evidence necessary to reach those answers never materialized. That reality does not diminish the importance of continuing to remember the case. On the contrary, memory becomes even more significant when certainty is absent. Remembering Georgiana Massey means remembering the value of human life amid political conflict. It means recognizing the cost that public violence can impose upon individuals who become caught within events larger than themselves. It also means acknowledging the responsibility of historical inquiry to distinguish carefully between documented facts, reasonable questions, and unproven conclusions. The integrity of the case depends upon respecting those distinctions, even when they leave its central mystery unresolved. Today, visitors crossing Ponte Garibaldi encounter the same river that flowed beneath the bridge on that spring evening in 1977. The city surrounding it has evolved, and the political struggles that define the years of lead have largely passed into history. Yet the bridge remains a silent witness to a moment that changed one family's life forever and left an enduring mark on Italy's national memory. Time has softened many of the immediate emotions surrounding the case, but it has not erased the questions. Who fired the .22 caliber bullet that struck Georgiana Massey from behind as she walked beside Gianfranco Papini? Why did an investigation involving years of inquiry, multiple theories, ballistic examinations, and later reviews never identify the person responsible? How can a homicide committed in the presence of so many people remain unresolved for nearly 50 years? The official record offers no definitive answers. Instead, it leaves us with a story built upon established facts and enduring uncertainty. An 18-year-old student attended a political demonstration on May 12, 1977. Violent clashes developed between demonstrators and security forces. Gunfire was heard in several areas of central Rome. While retreating toward Trastevere across Ponte Garibaldi, Georgiana Massey was struck by a .22 caliber bullet fired from behind. She died shortly afterward. Investigators pursued multiple theories, examined ballistic evidence, reopened the case after new testimony, and ultimately concluded that there was insufficient evidence to identify the killer. No one was prosecuted. The homicide remains officially unsolved. Perhaps that is why the story continues to matter. It reminds us that history is not always composed of neatly resolved narratives. Sometimes it leaves behind unanswered questions that endure across generations, asking each new reader not to solve the mystery through speculation, but to understand the circumstances that allowed it to remain unsolved. In the end, the greatest tragedy of the Georgiana Massey case is not only that a young life was taken, but that nearly half a century later, the truth of that final moment on Ponte Garibaldi remains beyond the reach of certainty. And until evidence capable of changing the historical record is discovered, that uncertainty will remain one of the defining legacies of both Georgiana Massey and one of Italy's most haunting unsolved political mysteries. Even decades after the official closure of the investigation, The death of Georgiana Massey continues to exist in a space that is neither fully historical nor fully resolved. It is recorded in legal archives as an unsolved homicide, yet it also lives in a broader cultural and political memory that has never stopped interpreting, questioning, and reinterpreting what happened on the evening of May 12, 1977. Unlike many criminal cases that gradually fade once the judicial system reaches its limit, this one remains active in public discourse. Not because new evidence has fundamentally changed its conclusions, but because the absence of certainty itself has become part of its meaning. The case occupies a rare position where law, history, and collective memory do not fully align. Legally, the situation is straightforward. No individual was ever identified with sufficient evidence to stand trial, and no court ever reached a verdict. The investigation ended because the evidentiary threshold required for prosecution could not be met. Historically, however, the case is far more complex. It took place during the years of Lead, a period in which political violence, public demonstrations, and state security operations frequently intersected in unpredictable and often chaotic ways. This context does not explain what happened to Georgiana Massey, but it does explain why the search for a definitive answer became so difficult. What remains particularly striking about the case is the way in which the same limited set of facts continues to support multiple interpretations. The established record confirms that she was shot with a .22 caliber bullet from behind while leaving a demonstration in central Rome. It confirms that the demonstration involved thousands of participants and a significant police presence, including plainclothes officers. It confirms that gunfire was reported in multiple locations during the unrest and that other injuries occurred. Beyond these points, however, the record becomes fragmented, and interpretation begins to replace certainty. For those who view the case through the lens of institutional accountability, the unresolved questions surrounding plainclothes officers remain central. The documented presence of armed individuals not in uniform during a prohibited demonstration raises concerns that have never been fully resolved in the public imagination, even though no court ever established their involvement in the shooting. For others, the emphasis lies instead on the broader environment of political violence in which armed extremist groups were active, making the possibility of demonstrator involvement a continuing point of discussion, even though it too was never proven in court. A third perspective, which pointed toward far-right involvement, emerged in later years, but similarly lacked the evidentiary foundation required to move beyond speculation. What is important, however, is that none of these interpretations ever achieved legal dominance. The judicial system did not select a winner among competing narratives. Instead, it withdrew from the field of interpretation altogether, leaving behind a record defined by insufficiency rather than conclusion. This absence of closure is what allows the case to remain active in historical memory long after its legal life ended. Over time, Georgiana Massey herself has become a symbol that exists somewhat independently of the unresolved mechanics of the shooting. Her identity as an 18-year-old student places her within a category of victims whose personal histories are often overshadowed by the political meanings later attached to their deaths. In public remembrance, she is frequently invoked not as a central figure in a legal investigation, but as a representation of a generation shaped by political tension and street-level conflict. This transformation is not unusual in cases from periods of intense social unrest, where individual stories become intertwined with broader historical narratives. Yet even this symbolic dimension does not replace the factual core of the case. The essential reality remains unchanged. A young woman was killed during a political demonstration, and no individual has ever been held legally responsible. That fact alone is sufficient to explain why the case continues to attract attention. Unresolved homicides carry a different kind of weight than resolved ones. They resist closure not only for families and investigators, but also for societies that attempt to make sense of their own past. The persistence of the Georgiana Massey case also highlights the limitations of retrospective certainty. As time passes, historical interpretation often becomes more structured, with clearer narratives emerging around complex events. However, in cases where physical evidence is incomplete and witness accounts are inconsistent, time does not necessarily bring clarity. Instead, it can solidify multiple competing versions of events, each supported by selective emphasis on certain facts and skepticism toward others. In this way, the passage of nearly 50 years has not resolved the case so much as stabilized its ambiguity. It is also worth noting that the absence of resolution does not imply a lack of effort. The investigation was reopened, evidence was re-examined, and testimony was revisited. Ballistic analysis was conducted on recovered firearms, and later inquiries attempted to incorporate new statements that emerged years after the original events. Each of these efforts reflected a genuine attempt to move closer to certainty. Yet each ultimately encountered the same structural limitation. Without the murder weapon and without definitive identification of shooter, no investigative pathway could be completed. What remains, therefore, is a case defined not by what is known about the perpetrator, but by what is known about the conditions in which the crime occurred. A demonstration marked by political tension, a city experiencing widespread unrest, security forces operating in both uniformed and plainclothes capacities, multiple reports of gunfire across different locations, a victim caught within that environment, and an investigation that, despite multiple efforts, could not isolate a single accountable individual. In reflecting on this case today, it becomes clear that its enduring significance does not rest solely on the identity of the shooter, but on the structural fragility of truth in moments of collective disorder. When events unfold rapidly across large crowds in environments shaped by fear, political division, and overlapping narratives, even serious investigative systems can struggle to reconstruct a single coherent account. The Georgiana Massey case stands as an example of how those conditions can leave a permanent gap between what is known and what is provable. Ultimately, the story returns to where it began, a young woman walking across a bridge in Rome, leaving a demonstration that had already descended into chaos, and being struck by a bullet whose origin has never been conclusively determined. Everything that followed, the investigation, the theories, the political debate, the reopened inquiries, exists in relation to that moment, but none of it has succeeded in fully explaining it. And so the case remains suspended in its original state. A documented death, a verified trajectory of a bullet, a city full of witnesses, and a truth that, despite decades of investigation, has never been legally established. In that sense, the legacy of Georgiana Massey is not only the memory of what happened to her, but also the enduring reminder of what has never been known. When a criminal investigation ends without resolution, what remains is not simply an empty file or an archived record. What remains is a form of narrative tension that continues to exist outside the boundaries of the legal system. The case of Georgiana Massey has become exactly that kind of enduring tension, a story fixed in time by documented facts, yet never fully settled by judicial conclusion. The passage of decades has not erased the central uncertainty. Instead, it has layered new meanings, interpretations, and reflections onto an event that remains fundamentally unchanged at its core. At the center of this persistence is a simple structural imbalance between what is known and what is knowable. Certain elements of the case are firmly established: the date, the location, the political context. The nature of the demonstration, the presence of security forces, the use of firearms in the broader environment of unrest, and the fatal impact of a .22 caliber bullet entering from behind. These facts form a stable foundation that has never been seriously disputed. Yet surrounding this foundation is a wide field of uncertainty where the most important question, the identity of the shooter, remains unanswered. It is within this gap that interpretation has continuously expanded. Over time, the absence of a definitive conclusion has allowed the case to function less as a closed historical episode and more as an open interpretive space. Different observers have returned to the same limited set of facts and drawn different conclusions, not because the facts themselves have changed, but because the meaning assigned to those facts depends heavily on perspective. In this sense, the case illustrates how historical understanding is often shaped as much by the limits of evidence as by the presence of it. When evidence is incomplete, interpretation becomes not just a supplement to knowledge, but a substitute for it. Yet it would be misleading to suggest that this interpretive openness is purely abstract. It has real consequences for how societies remember, discuss, and emotionally process events of political violence. The death of Georgiana Massey is not remembered only as a forensic or judicial problem. It is remembered as a human event that occurred within a specific social atmosphere marked by tension, confrontation, and fear. That dual identity, simultaneously a legal mystery and a human tragedy, is part of what has kept the case alive in public consciousness long after many other events from the same period have faded. One of the most striking aspects of this case is how it resists closure even at the level of narrative structure. In most true crime cases, the progression moves from event to investigation to resolution. Even when justice is imperfect, there is usually a formal endpoint, a conviction, an acquittal, or a clearly articulated explanation supported by evidence. Here, that structural resolution never arrived. The investigation did not culminate in a judicial determination of responsibility. Instead, it ended in procedural acknowledgement of insufficiency. This absence of closure is not just a detail of legal history. It fundamentally shapes how the case continues to be retold. As a result, every retelling of the case must navigate a tension between factual restraint and interpretive necessity. On one hand, the documented record imposes strict boundaries. There is no confirmed perpetrator, no conclusive forensic linkage to a specific individual or group, and no judicial verdict establishing guilt. On the other hand, the human mind naturally seeks coherence in events that appear violent, sudden, and unjust. That search for coherence often leads to competing hypotheses, each attempting to impose order on what remains, in legal terms, unresolved. This is where the broader historical context becomes unavoidable. The years of lead in Italy were characterized by a dense overlap of political activism, ideological conflict, state security operations, and episodic violence. Within such an environment, public demonstrations were not merely expressions of opinion. They were often sites of confrontation between competing visions of society. The demonstration on May 12, 1977, in which Georgiana was killed, took place within that larger framework. However, while the context helps explain the intensity of the environment, it does not resolve the specific question of responsibility. Context can clarify conditions, but it cannot substitute for evidence. The persistence of the case also highlights the fragile boundary between memory and certainty. Collective memory tends to preserve events that carry emotional, symbolic, or political significance, even when the factual details remain incomplete. Over time, the memory of Georgiana Massey has become intertwined with broader reflections on state authority, civil liberties, and the costs of political conflict. Yet memory, unlike judicial fact-finding, does not require definitive resolution. It can accommodate contradiction, ambiguity, and unresolved tension. This is both its strength and its limitation. Within legal systems, however, ambiguity is not an endpoint but a barrier. The failure to identify a perpetrator is not interpreted as a conclusion but as an unfinished task. In this case, repeated investigative efforts, including the initial inquiry, later reviews, and the reopening prompted by new testimony decades later, demonstrate an ongoing institutional recognition that the question of responsibility remains formally unanswered. Yet each attempt encountered the same structural limitations: absence of the murder weapon, inconsistent witness accounts, and insufficient forensic linkage to any identified individual. Over time, these limitations have themselves become part of the case's identity. The investigation is no longer remembered solely for what it discovered, but also for what it could not discover. The absence of resolution has become as significant as the documented facts. In this way, the case exists in a dual state, historically fixed but interpretively open, legally closed but intellectually active. Perhaps the most enduring lesson embedded in this case is not about a single moment in Rome in 1977, but about the broader nature of truth under conditions of uncertainty. It demonstrates that truth in a legal sense depends on thresholds of proof that may not always be reachable. Even when a real event unquestionably occurred, a person was killed, that fact is not in dispute. But the transformation of that fact into a legally actionable narrative requires evidentiary continuity that the available record could not provide. When that continuity breaks, the justice system cannot complete its narrative, even if the underlying event remains real and undeniable. This gap between event and explanation is where the case continues to resonate. It forces an uncomfortable recognition. Not all events that are real can be fully reconstructed, and not all truths that are felt can be legally proven. In the absence of resolution, societies are left to navigate between evidence and interpretation, between history and memory, between what is known and what is believed. And so the story of Georgiana Massey does not end in the traditional sense. It remains suspended at the intersection of those tensions. The investigation has reached its procedural limits. The judicial system has recorded its inability to determine responsibility. Yet the questions themselves persist, not as active legal inquiries, but as enduring historical ones. What happened on Ponte Garibaldi that evening remains a documented fact without a confirmed explanation. The bullet is known. The victim is known. The political context is known. But the identity behind the trigger remains unknown. In the end, the case does not offer closure. Instead, it offers a reminder that some events enter history not through resolution, but through permanence of uncertainty. And in that permanence, the story of Georgiana Massey continues to exist, not as a solved mystery, but as an unresolved question that time has preserved rather than answered. Some cases end, others remain. The death of Georgiana Massey belongs to the second category, not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence that exists has never been enough to complete the story. The facts are stable: a political demonstration in Rome on May 12, 1977, a period of intense unrest during the years of lead, the presence of thousands of demonstrators, and a large deployment of security forces, gunfire reported in multiple areas, and a .22 caliber bullet striking a young woman from behind as she crossed Ponte Garibaldi. Everything beyond that core sequence becomes interpretation, reconstruction, and ultimately uncertainty. What makes this case endure is not complexity in the technical sense, but incompleteness in the human sense. The investigation did not fail in a single moment. It accumulated limits over time. No murder weapon was ever conclusively identified. No witness account achieved universal consistency. No forensic pathway produced a definitive attribution. Each investigative attempt approached the same boundary and stopped at the same point: the absence of proof sufficient to transform possibility into legal certainty. And so the case settled into a rare and uneasy condition. It is not forgotten because it is too symbolically loaded. It is not solved because it is too evidentially incomplete. It is not active because the legal system has exhausted its formal mechanisms. It exists instead in a suspended state between history and memory. In that space, the meaning of the event has shifted over time. For some, it represents the fragility of civil liberties during periods of political tension. For others, it represents the unpredictable violence of an era in which ideological conflict spilled into public streets. For legal observers, it remains a study in the limits of forensic reconstruction under chaotic conditions. For historians, it is a reminder that even well-documented periods can contain irreducible uncertainties. Yet none of these interpretations replaces the central fact: a life ended abruptly, and responsibility was never established in court. That absence is what continues to define the case more than any theory ever could. Time does not resolve all questions. In some instances, it simply changes their context. What was once an urgent investigative file becomes a historical reference point. What was once a police inquiry becomes a subject of academic discussion. What was once a public controversy becomes a recurring memory revisited on anniversaries. In articles, in discussions that return again and again to the same unanswered point. The question itself remains unchanged. Not who Georgiana Massey was. Not where she was. Not when it happened. But how it happened and by whom. And in the absence of an answer, the silence takes its place. Not as resolution, but as structure. Not as closure, but as condition. The case continues to exist because it was never completed in the way criminal cases are meant to be. Completed. There is no final sentence, no definitive attribution, no moment where uncertainty is formally replaced by certainty. Instead, there is only the documented event, the unresolved investigation, and the passage of time that preserves both without reconciling them. And so the story remains where it has always been since that evening in 1977, suspended in the space between fact and explanation, between evidence and meaning, between what is known and what will never be known with certainty. The silence that follows is not empty. It is the final form of the question itself.